So here's how I think about everything. So this is a book that's going to happen at some point. So this is how it goes. At the end of World War II, after the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and a global catastrophe, one of the things that political elites learned in the West was you have to insulate labor markets. If you subject labor markets to simple price competition, and if you have open financial flows, you will destabilize those labor markets and you will cause a lot of volatility in those markets, which basically means labor gets annoyed. When labor gets annoyed and that coincides with large financial crises, you get into big depressions. And then the politics of that get very nasty. So learning from that, we decided we would insulate labor markets. And we did that in the United States with COLA contracts, cost of living adjustments. You did that in Germany with corporatist institutions. You had big labor on one side, big business on the other. Everything was negotiated. In a sense, it was a labor market cartel. Hold that concept in your head. So that cartel worked really well for a while. And at the same time, product markets were actually quite protected. We had a world in which we had countries that all made similar things and then traded them with each other. Whereas now under globalization, we have countries that do very, very different things and then trade very differently with each other through much more integrated labor markets and much more integrated financial flows. But before we get there, those product markets and labor markets, which were highly regulated, think the way that America used to do airlines. Right? Think about the fact that you couldn't open a bank account anywhere except in your home country. There were no derivatives. There were no global financial flows. That system produced a ton of inflation, and that's when it blew up in a crisis of inflation in the 1970s. In order to restore the value of capital, we underwent an experiment, which is variously called the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. And once you unleash those forces, which are basically things you do, you integrate, you privatize, you liberalize, you marketize, you create a lot of openness in the system. And all of those protections, first in labor markets, either deliberately through policy, beating down on unions, or alternatively much later through things like market integration, which basically says to German workers, you're not really going to have a pay rise for 12 years because globalization for you starts 60 kilometers east of the Elbe. If you don't like it, we'll move the factory to, let's say, Romania. So there's a great deal of labor market discipline brought into it, and productivity breaks its link with wages. And we see this across the OECD beginning in the 1970s, and this is the beginning of the big inequality skew. So to fill that in, what happens? We liberalize finance, and everyone borrows, whether it's governments or households or individuals, and we triple private credit in the United States, and we double it in the European area. So we all live off of debt. Now, you can do that so long as interest rates are low and your incomes are growing, but your incomes aren't growing because you can no longer claim your share of productivity. So what happens is we start to get a massive skew in inequality with all those things going up to the top 1%, as we know. Now, in 2008, that system had a heart attack, but rather than allowing it to crash and reset, we bailed it out with $17 trillion of public money through the central banks of the world. And what happened was another decade in which wages didn't grow. And more people got annoyed, and they were told they had to tighten their belts and do more with less, while the top 20% weighed off with even more of the gains. And at the end of that, something else happened. We started to notice that unless you're a digital monopolist like Google, your product markets were incredibly stressed too. Think about the price of computers, think about the price of cars. From a consumer value point of view, it's amazing, but you think about the margins of most businesses, even if you've got globalized supply chains, they're incredibly tight. So businesses are getting squeezed, labor markets are getting squeezed. So the second cartel, the product market cartel, falls apart with globalization. And we try various things like the EU to basically create a region-wide cartel, but it doesn't really work. And then at the end of it, what's the last cartel standing? It was the political cartel that made all of that possible. The two-party system and multi-party democracies that guaranteed all of those institutions of the post-war compact. But all those institutions have been bypassed. They're irrelevant. They've been blown up. They've been integrated, marketized, privatized, globalized, both in product markets and in labor markets. So what exactly are they there to do? So they talk more and more, they tweet more and more, they govern less and less. They externalize to agencies such as the EU, the WTO, they push it up, they push it out. You have election after election where less and less seems to be decided. And eventually, when the system has a heart attack and has a 10-year cardiac arrest, and we're told that everything's fine because the top 10% and the top 1% are doing fabulously well, It turns out a lot of us don't believe that story anymore. And we start to defect from that cartel. And we start to go other places. And we don't like some of those places because they remind us of the 1930s. But the system itself is broken, and it's not going to be fixed anytime soon.